Welcome to another episode of Fortified Lessons on Love and Divorce, hosted by Toomey Family Law. I'm Laticia Braving. We are, of course, joined today by Leisa Toomey, Director of Toomey Family Law. Leisa, welcome back.
Thank you, Laticia. Good to be here.
Absolutely. And today's guest is someone who plays a very important role in family law matters with you, Leisa, as well as in general, and helping shape healthier, happier families after divorce. Laura Dodds is a single expert witness and an appointed family consultant for the Family and Federal Circuit Court of Australia. She has over 20 years' experience in undertaking forensic social science risk assessments and working with individuals and families who've experienced trauma, substance misuse issues, offending behaviour, domestic and family violence, parental separation, and mental health issues. She is the Program Coordinator for the Bachelor of Social Work and an Associate Lecturer in Social Work, teaching in undergraduate and master's programs within the School of Law and Society at the University of the Sunshine Coast. She's also the Managing Director and Senior Family Consultant of Edgeways Consultancy on the Sunshine Coast, a forensic assessment agency providing best practice, high-quality social science assessments of children and their families. Laura, welcome to the couch.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thank you for that very warm introduction.
It was very detailed. So let's break that down for the layman. What do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the family court, federal circuit court space, my role is to help the court, help the parents navigate understanding the needs of their children, the parenting arrangements that are going to work in terms of the children's developmental needs, as well as the capacity of the parents, and to provide that advice over to the decision makers, which is either mum or dad if they're going to follow a consent route, or the judicial officers making those decisions.
Now, you obviously work closely with lawyers like Leisa Toomey. Leisa, when would you engage someone like Laura? At what stage?
Sure. So when parents or when a client comes to me and I can see there's high conflict in relation to parenting issues and they just cannot resolve those issues, then you need, let's call it an umpire. You need someone to come in, have a discussion with both of the parents, and maybe in fact have a discussion with the children, and then make a determination about what is in the best interest of this family. So it assists not only the parties in being able to bridge and create an agreement, because they then have some guidelines, but it also assists the court in relation to what the parties, what their level of dispute is, and what they need to consider in relation to what is in the best interest of the children. So it's very important evidence in high-level conflict that relates to parenting matters. And some would say it's probably the fundamental baseline of really how the party should move forward.
Paint the picture of what high conflict actually means in practice.
Okay. So usually in relation to parenting matters, we try and mediate them out. So that'd be that first course, getting the parties together and see if we can have some sort of resolution by way of a cooperative dispute resolution process like mediation. Sometimes, though, mediation, it teases out what really the issues are and why parents can be a little bit intractable about their contact issues. You're nodding your head going, you're right, I know where this is going. So that's when, as lawyers, we grab onto people like Laura, literally, and that would be our go-to, where we say, all right, well, this is an intractable dispute. We can't bridge this gap, so we need someone who's an expert to come in and talk to the family and try and assist the parties in making a recommendation. And the courts also very much not rely on, because the courts are independent. It is one piece of evidence that a court can take into account in relation to when determining parenting matters. A very important piece of evidence.
So can one party request it and another refuse it, or can it be court-ordered? In what situation does this unfold?
So from a legal perspective, either parties agree by consent to reach out to a family report writer like Laura, or in the alternative, if the parties cannot agree by consent about a report, but one party is of the view that that would assist them moving forward, then you'd ask the court to make an order in that respect. Yeah.
How common is this? How frequently do you have to engage someone like Laura?
in parenting matters where there is conflict, it makes sense to engage someone like Laura to come in. So to answer your question, I'd have to say in most high conflict parenting matters, you will find there is some form of social science evidence that comes to the fore to assist the parties in moving forward.
What does it look like if you're engaged to come in and work with a family? Can you just step out what the process would look like?
Yeah, sure. At the beginning of the process, the parties will agree on what documents get sent through to us. If the matter's at court, typically that would involve all of the documents that are already before the court. If the parties are following a more family dispute resolution mediation path, they might just agree to write their own individual overviews of what's happening. And sometimes families come without any information too. So if we have that opportunity, we'll read that information first. Typically, we understand that that information has been written for a different purpose, though. There is quite a different role in terms of, the legal path and the social science path. So we read that to get some context, but not necessarily to preform any ideas about, what those key issues in dispute are, or I guess the position of each family. We will chat with the parents first. So we meet with them individually. We'll invite one parent to come in first. We spend time with them talking to get to know themselves, the relationship, their experiences of communication. We undertake risk assessment questions and then spending the rest of the time talking about the children, getting to know their needs, their interests, relationships, and what each parent sees their children need from them in this new family landscape and what that looks like. We talk about their proposal and quite often we'll unpack that and challenge that and talk about alternatives as well from that. It's really common that the parents will have some different narratives about the same situation, and that's not necessarily that there's, I guess, an incidence of dishonesty there. It would be like Leisa and I going to watch the same movie and me saying, oh, that was really boring and a really terrible film, and Leisa saying, oh, that was incredibly inspiring and one of the best movies of my life. Because, things are interpretive and there's lots of perspective and experience and our own individual ideologies come into those things. So that's our job, is to hear both of those narratives. That process is really about taking some time as an independent person, not involved with all the emotions of the family breakdown, to invite the child to share with us their experience. What are they making sense of? What do they actually think is going on? What would you like them to remember is most important for you? So it's really that process where children feel like they get an opportunity to say, hey, I'm part of this. I'm having an experience in this too, and these are the things that matter to me.
And I'm guessing being away from mum and dad maybe gives them a bit more of an opportunity to voice their true concerns or thoughts because they're not feeling pressured by one party or the other. Would that be the case?
What is important to me is transparency with children and making sure that the impact I have as a professional involved in their life is a positive one. So I'm always upfront with children to let them know that, unlike a counselling session, our conversation will be shared back with mum and dad in most aspects of that, and with other people that are helping mum and dad to make those decisions. So some children can feel nervous about that, and we talk that through, and then we come up with some strategies around, how could I let mum and dad know this without you feeling worried about hurting their feelings? That's the common thing that comes up for kids, is they don't want to feel like they're disappointing mum or dad. Yeah.
So as a parent, if I was told by my lawyer, we're going to go down this path, I'd be immediately, and I'm just, speculating this is how I'd react. I'd be like, what do you mean this person's going to come in and talk to my kid and come into my home and observe me and judge me? I can imagine it would be a bit of a confronting, prickly situation for parents, even if they were the ones who initiated it.
So your reaction is spot on. that is normally what the reaction is. What do you mean that I'm going to have someone tell me what's going to happen with my family? And then you've got to take them through the pathway and explain that, well, if you two can't reach an agreement, someone else needs to make that decision. You are leaving it open for a judge to make that decision, but a judge needs to be assisted by what Laura and Laura's colleagues do in order to assess what is the most appropriate course, because rightly so, everyone has their own narrative about what's happening in a relationship. One of the other most common questions I get is, but you don't understand. Little Billy, I know that his father will be at him and that he'll school him up about what to say and how to say it and all those sorts of things. And then, then you're managing that expectation and bringing them back down to where we need to be by explaining that people like Laura are highly trained. They understand that level of indoctrination,
Scripting,
and I'm just going to use that word, and they know how to work through that. So when a family report is released, that's when we can get some dialogue about resolving matters, because they're confronting, very confronting. So I've certainly been in matters where a client has come to me and has read a family report and has been gobsmacked by how they have been interpreted in that report. But that's the risk of the report process, that what you think is your paradigm may not be what's being expressed. Would you say that's right, Laura?
Yeah, and that's a really common experience, isn't it? I think even reading about ourselves, people, even our closest friends, sometimes holding that mirror up to give us feedback is a really confronting process. So when you layer on top of that these complex, uncomfortable, distressing feelings that are already accompanying the separation, your whole worldview has shifted at that point. You don't know what's happening with your property, like your basic, accommodation, income, food. So all of these basic needs become vulnerable at that time when you're in these negotiations on top of your most, prized and secure relationships being with your children, to then have a stranger add an opinion on that and to then offer that in a way that comes with such sense of weight and authority, I could imagine would be highly confronting, and certainly something that I would be extremely anxious about receiving. I would be highly critical, and would absolutely push back on that before I could take some time to genuinely process that and hopefully read through how that assessment was made and what logic was used to be able to come to those recommendations.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly a very vulnerable position for a family to be in when you're at that level of crisis, that you need those supports.
Laura's role as well. When it may be that we send clients thinking that, okay, well, Laura will just make a recommendation and then we'll just, we'll work with that and see how it goes. But it goes further than that, because sometimes Laura might make a recommendation about something a bit further, like a psychiatric assessment. And that then takes a whole new level to what's happening in the parenting dynamic. So, Laura, in circumstances like that, would you I would imagine you would only make those sorts of recommendations in extreme cases and how a parent presents.
Yeah, and I have had to do that and actually quite recently had to do that. And it's really, again, that's coming back to that risk assessment that we undertake in terms of the children. I think a really clear discernment that's important to make is that the role of the family report or the intervention of the single expert witness is not to find evidence or fact, and that's where there's those lines between the legal pathway and the social science pathway, and there is, however, the role for the social scientist to be making that risk assessment, which is all of the training and the things we have. So where we are then assessing either live in those engagements with the family or collectively from the information we've gathered that there are serious risks in that regard, we're going to escalate that fairly quickly, either to the solicitors if the matter's not before the court, or certainly to the judicial officer if the matter is before the court. And we will be very clear in that instance about what is the level of risk and what are the measures that really should be the best path taken in that immediate future to manage that from a child safety perspective.
Are there? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, and just following on from that, how important these reports are, and also taking the very considered advice by our social scientists. There certainly have been occasions where social scientists have said, don't release this report to anyone. This report needs to be released in a controlled environment. And there are some times where we actually have to release where the report is actually provided to the court, and then the court decides how the parties receive the information. That's how highly delicate this process can be.
When you say highly delicate, what do you mean?
Well, families are complex and behaviours are complex, and understanding, and I guess what comes with releasing the family report is knowledge as well. So certainly when we might have something like a psychiatric concern or very high level family violence, we are in a significant role of responsibility there, and in terms of the whole professional team, to understanding if this report is released and the alleged perpetrator then is privy to all of this information that I've had to document, so that the decision maker, being the court, know why I've made this recommendation. That information potentially can be misused and therefore place, that victim survivor even at further risk of harm. So, we are consciously making active decisions around safety, not just for children, but for the parents throughout that whole continuum, and having to work very closely with that responsibility and then communicate that really effectively to the other decision makers in that process.
In the instance of family violence, are there any occasions where you would bypass the courts and report it directly to the police? Is that ever a requirement?
So the requirement for us is about children. Yeah. So if there is risk assessed by us in relation to the children, which is outside of what's already been reported. So the court are really making great progress in terms of making sure that children's safety and children's best interests are really moving to the forefront. So they now have an officer who works in the court who is the interface between the child protection system and the family court. So a lot of that information sharing occurs. If new allegations, however, that weren't in those earlier screening tools come out, or if direct disclosures are made, then I'm a mandatory reporter. So that information would go to Child Protection Services. It's not necessarily my role to report adult issues of safety, but I would certainly take that responsibility to have that conversation with that parent, to advise them of, what are their support options in terms of accessing, maybe the DV hotline, or referring them back to, if they've got a lawyer, to say, I'm really concerned about your safety. I've certainly had to do that before. I would like to facilitate a conversation with you and your lawyer about what that safety framework looks like, because as we all know, and certainly in popular media, the general population are still catching up with what does family violence look like, what are these different typologies, and how do we assess lethality and that level of risk. So we take that on, I guess, as our responsibility in working with really vulnerable families to support them to have more education around that. Yeah.
From what you were saying, Leisa, it's not just that extreme end. It can be any form of high conflict where there might even be substance abuse involved, emotional abuse, whatever it might be. I guess from the conversations we've had, it's not just that extreme end. It can be your average, quote unquote, kind of households who need to go down this path.
Absolutely,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I'd
We
agree
will
with
often
that.
assess that there is no risk, and that the barriers to reaching these parenting plans are actually really expected relational complexities just to do with the grief and loss of the separation. It is quite common that our risk assessment will be there are no safety risks, and these parents have two wonderfully competent, caring, loving parents who are going through a really normal, distressing period because of the complexity and grief and loss of a separation, and that's more common than not. So then our role is about helping mum and dad to get that shared understanding of where each other are coming from. Particularly, this is where the family reports can have real benefit that sit outside of the affidavits, because we can spend a lot of time talking about what used to work really well. What are your principles and values around parenting? Were they in dispute before the separation? Quite often they weren't. And that's what unified the couple in the first place. I love asking the question, what drew you to the other party? We're trying to get back to remembering and at least finding that scaffolding to say, when we're through the complex nightmare of this separation, where you're at the abyss and you feel like this is never going to end, it will. And let us take you on the journey to remind you what you loved and cared about this other parent previously, and that your children still love and care of them. And so it is then about, helping navigate through what pace, what circumstances, what support do the parents need to navigate this, remembering their children are at the forefront of that, and those journeys in that are very different. Yeah, and often we know that the parent who ended the relationship, made that call, is far more along that continuum than the one who feels a bit sidelined.
Yeah.
But equally, distressed at that or in another phase of that grief and loss cycle. And then the children are on a different path as well. And so it is about the family report in the way that I like to write them, is to, I guess, create that shared understanding of, what were the strengths, where are those, barriers now, where are those tricky conflict points, and over and above that, this is what your children love about both of you, and this is what their needs are, and their point in time in the grief process, and what they need from you right now and moving forward.
What's very interesting about that also, from my experience, is when that family report hits the deck and clients read those reports, it's what their children have to say. That is really confronting for them. And also it's been quite helpful in having them, I guess, come back to a position where they need to actually stop the conflict, because this is how it's impacting on their kids.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful point. Quite commonly, when you were talking earlier about, as a parent turning up to this process, the most common position that is the starting point for the parents is, I feel so sad, it's got to this point, my children have to be involved. And part of my role is saying, in time, I hope you appreciate the gift you've given your children by allowing them to be involved. This is actually about their life, and they want to feel seen and heard. And we will do that in the most empowering way we can as professionals in that process, to unburden that sense of responsibility, which is why the questions aren't, who do you want to live with, or, who's better, mum or dad? That they are very damaging and significantly weighted questions for a young person, but it's about that curiosity, like, what are your favourite things about mum? Like, if you could give us some hot tips around things she could do differently. And children are incredibly insightful about relationships, and their narrative is so important, and being able to share that back with mum and dad to say, you might feel like you're doing a really poor job at the moment in this. Your kids think you're doing amazing. And even that can be really powerful to share back with the parents, to say, yeah, your world feels like it's really dark and grim right now, and you feel like you're crying all the time and overwhelmed. Sad things are sad. Let your children see that. Don't burden them with that. Have a boundary, but it's really healthy for them to see you sad about something sad, as it is to then give them permission to be sad about their family shifting. And it's okay that their family looks and feels different to how it was before, because families are all different. Yeah.
So in summary, essentially, you don't need to be in a family situation that is actually proving your children to be at risk. These could be ordered for any household where their parents just can't come to a decision, and it's got to be pushed along.
Absolutely.
So how do we get, as you say, two parents who really love their children and want the best for them, yet they're so toxic that they cannot come to an agreement? Why are we like this as humans? How is this happening in our society where your job exists and two grown adults can't make a decision for their children?
Yes, Laura, answer that.
Do you know, it's both such a simple and such a complex answer to that. You know, I think our earlier conversation off screen about, you know, emotional literacy not being taught in schools, about how to have healthy conflict. You know, most of the time, most commonly, part of my assessment is saying these parents managed really normal situational conflict in really polarized ways. They then have a continuum of these little ruptures in their relationship that over time just don't get adequately repaired in the way that the individuals feel then soothed and recovered from that, which then leads to the point of this sense of polarized unknowing of each other and ways to go about communication. We don't teach that well. We then layer on top of that, you know, people most often, apart from our latest trend of, terrible trashy TV like Married at First Sight, most people enter these relationships with genuine intentions that they're going to work and that they genuinely love these people. So, you know, that's then layered on top of, you know, potentially people going through their childhood having a vision around, what is my life going to look like? I'm going to be married, I'm going to have kids. And then you get to the point where that all falls apart in ways that are so often outside of either of your circumstances, that not only then is that whole life vision being challenged and shattered before your eyes, but your sense of knowing yourself is also really vulnerable at that point. You're questioning, how did this happen? So, you know, that lack of coherence to make sense then leads to a lot of stress and distress. You know, we start to question everything about ourselves, everything about the relationship, and before we know it, we're just standing on a bit of an island feeling very alone. And a typical response to that is self-preservation, deflection, anger. They're all really normal responses to big, difficult emotions. And then when we're trying to hold on to the only sense of joy we have left in our life, which is often then those children, that's a very emotionally loaded situation.
It's a tangled web. Laura, do you think, and I've sometimes considered this, that you're right, during a relationship, I mean, people have their ups and downs and they try to work their way through it, and they're managing their children, trying to parent their children. So they reach, somewhere in that relationship they met some common ground about what to do about how to parent their children. I feel that separation gives parties the all clear to be polarised and go back into their fighting corner and hold their position on what they want to do about their children, and they lose the perspective about trying to reach some compromise about parenting their children.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the most common questions I say if I'm trying to dig a little bit deeper with a parent is I will say, so how would this situation now for your child have been managed if you were still in a relationship? And then I will say to parents, when you get to that point of separation and then you've got all of that layered stuff and you're armoring up for your position, actually some of these relational dynamics or values, mobile phones and things like that are common parenting disputes. How would you have actually resolved this, having different views, if you still loved each other? Because as two people who are parenting a child or children, these issues are part of parenting. Yeah. And then when we separate, it is like there's this sense of, now I'm going to assert my governance around this is the way it's going to happen.
Or demonise the other parent to the extent that justifies their conduct.
Yeah. And it's the same with that relational stuff. Even in an intact family, you and your children have very different relationships. There are closer affinities between parent A and child A and parent A and child B, and likewise. And then we get into this conflict, and that's all of a sudden polarized. Oh, Tommy doesn't want to go over there because they're just much closer to me. Okay, but that doesn't strip their right of having a beautiful, meaningful, quality relationship with the other parent. And this is a time, if you give your children and yourselves permission, to actually just embed your own sense of what do I want that relationship to look like. When you've been parenting under that stress of the demise of a relationship, you might not have been parenting in your best self either. And I think the more we start to afford even just the removing of our own mental load to say, I no longer need to manage or look after what that other parent is doing. I need to trust that as someone I chose to co-parent with in the first place, they're going to make the decisions that are within their capacity, and I'm just looking after my own home and my own parenting now. And that's exactly what will happen, is that children do hold us accountable. When they become 14, 15, 16, if you've been that parent that is invested in nurturing the relationship you have with that child, that's going to show. If you've been that parent who's spent a lot of time running the other parent down, making negative things, making those transitions complicated, children aren't going to value that. And they're going to hold you accountable for that in a myriad of ways. And often the way we see that is they opt to go and live with the other parent. At the end of the day, my final conversations with parents in this is, you're accountable to yourself and to your child. The court or, in the mediation, you might come up with whatever agreements get made. At the end of the day, your accountability is to your child and your behaviour, your narrative, the way you facilitate or restrict their loving relationships with their other parent or extended family is going to come back on you.
A common theme through all of these interviews so far, particularly with these professionals, it seems that we're just so under-equipped to be going into relationship and into marriage in particular and to be parents. It's just this emotional immaturity, the financial illiteracy, all of those components that make up healthy love or healthy relationships. We're just not equipped to do it well.
100%. Yeah. And you don't get that textbook with parenting. Every day is a challenge and a mystery and a puzzle unraveling. So, yeah. And I think that's an important aspect, that, I know Lisa and other legal professionals will often share with families is this process isn't a scrutiny process. It's about an inquiry process to say what's working, what's not working, what do your children need, and what are the resources within yourself, this parenting team, and the situation that are present right now or that we can acquire to allow that child to live their best life.
So teenagers are really hard in this process, really hard. There is a fundamental premise that, really teenagers self-place. And there's not much you can do about that. I mean, I've been in court where judges have screamed out from the bench and saying, well, what do you want me to do with a 16-year-old, And it's so true. I mean, they do whatever they want to do. That message getting across to parents who are in conflict is really difficult. That it may be the case that a parent is not seeing another child and the child is at 15, 16, 14, 15, 16 years of age, and then there's a whole lot of blame placed on the other parent as a result of that. But I just don't think that parents understand that these kids are so smart and they are able to make up their own minds about what they want to do, but it's that blame game that goes on. I mean, personally, when people come to me and talk about their teenagers, I usually put my hand up and say, I can't do much about that. They're just going to be what they are, subject to whatever, if there's something serious happening in the household, like, significant substance abuse or something of that nature. But you can't do much about it. What's your view about that, Laura?
Yeah, and look, often it's a reflection of what went on well before the separation. These relational attachments and bonds by that point are fairly well formed. They're also really developmentally appropriate. There are periods where, young people are agitated with a parent and want some space from them as they're trying to navigate their own worldview, their own values, take, that passing of the baton from, I'm your moral and ethical governance as your parent while you're not young enough to have that, and that process in, mum or dad being able to hand over the baton to say, now the consequences of choices become yours because we're handing that over. So sometimes the tensions in timing around the young person is ready but the parent's not ready can really lean into that. And often the young person is going to elect to self-place with the parent who is keeping the home environment the calmest, who is not agitating negative views about the other parent, because their position then to not see the other parent is not actually often about that parent. It's just about the least drama-filled option for them at that time because it's too much.
That's really important.
Yeah. Their priorities are not their parents by that point.
So legally, Lisa, in that situation where, say, we've been to court, the court order's there, the parenting orders are in place, yet the teenager refuses, won't go. What does the law say in that regard?
So, by all means, as a court officer, there is a duty to uphold court orders. So, and a court order means that you are entitled to bring an enforcement application and seek an enforcement of that order. In the practical world, that just doesn't. Sometimes it just doesn't work, particularly with children or teenage children, and that means that someone's got to back off. That's really what it comes down to.
They've got a bee in their bonnet still. That might not be the reality.
They may have a bee in their bonnet, but, it is really hard to make a teenager do what they do not want to do. Would you agree with that, Laura?
100%. And often the outcome will be that
tragic. It could be tragic.
It will go back to the court. The court sensibly will say the young person needs to go and see a family consultant and have their views and wishes ascertained. And quite commonly, I'm sure Leisa would agree, that the orders are the child spends time with the parents
As agreed.
as agreed or at their own discretion.
Could that be damaging to a child, though, if they don't want to go see the other parent and the court's forcing them to?
Yeah. Very damaging. Yeah.
And you know, I've been in matters where where my client is not seeing their teenage son or daughter, and as a lawyer, you know, you've got to give the advice and say, you know, sometimes a parent just has to back off, and you really are the parent that's got to make that decision. And I will send my clients away to talk to therapists and talk to counsellors about that, to reach a decision about what they ought do about the situation. And you know, it's just it's a really hard decision to make, to have a parent make, but sometimes it just has to be made.
Yeah.
A parent has to back off for the sake of the child to stop the conflict.
Yeah.
Because you want these kids to be growing into happy, healthy adults.
And sometimes all it takes is a little bit of space. Let the child know that you still love them, you're still there for them no matter what. The door's always open.
Yep.
But if they want to stay there for however long they need, that's enforcing trust. It's enabling them to just process it the way they need to process it, I guess, and just hoping that they come back around. It would be horrifying as a parent to be faced with that reality.
Yeah.
If we take a step back to the process, if I'm a parent who I have to go through this process, what can I expect in terms of having a conversation with you? Is it a face-to-face interview? Are you observing me? What can I expect?
Yeah, so we do those typically at a private office, so a premise that we don't go into the homes or anything like that. So they'll come to an appointment. They'll come into a room and, we'll explain what the process is going to be for that day. So then they will have that interview process with myself. We'll go through all of those things. Typically then they'll head off, they'll go and have a break, the other parent will come in. So then we've sort of got, I guess, a good understanding of the parenting issues. After lunch then at an agreed time, the child, the young people, the kids come in. Most commonly, we will do observations of the children with each parent. There are times we won't. Sometimes when they're teenagers, it's more harmful than good. I don't mean that in a level of abusive way, but it really puts the young people appropriately offside to be like, why are you watching me with my parent? Or if there's been long periods of estrangement, because there is a real difference between this being an assessment process and not a therapeutic process. So if it can't be emotionally safe to do it on the day, then we don't.
How do you handle it for really young ones who can't talk?
Yeah, so then we do the observation session, and the period of observation will then be longer, and we're then really utilising, I guess, our training and our knowledge around attachment behaviours and observing, the transition, so from parent A to parent B, how the child goes, how the parent who's receiving the child is able to soothe the child, those sort of things. Is there a marked difference in the child in terms of, their behaviour and interactions with one parent to the other parent? So we're looking at those behavioural cues and things like that. And we're doing it in the same environment so that there's, we're trying to decrease the influences and those external factors as much as possible.
There was a family report writer who had significant experience. I used to work with in the family court. He's much retired now. And he would actually go to the parties' houses. So he would invite himself for dinner, and he would then say to me, it was a great cue, because sometimes he'd say, the little kids would be sitting at the table and the table would be set and everything would look really beautiful, and then the little kid would drop a bombshell going, why are we doing this? We never do this. What is this all, And he said it was a really good cue for him about, what is going on in the household and how the kids are reacting. Kids have such an honest filter.
Yeah, we'll get that to the observations first, and then we get to go into the, the session. They'll be like, oh, I saw you, playing this game today. Like, tell me about that. And often they'll be like, oh, yeah, she never normally plays with me at home. And then, you can put that into context with running a home is busy and, all of those things. But children, they're mostly more honest and more unguarded than not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it must be hard because my 5-year-old at the moment, I'm boring all the time. You're boring, Mum. You're boring. You don't do anything fun with me.
Yeah.
And I say, oh, is that true? And he goes, yeah, we never do anything. And I said, well, what about the weekend when we went to the 2 really big parks and we did this? And he goes, oh, yeah, I forgot. But to anybody else hearing that, it'd be like, oh, she doesn't do anything with him. She just works or does this and does that. Mummy's always working. She's always at her computer. But, I think as a parent, if my son said that in this assessment process, I'd be concerned that, hey, what my 5-year-old is projecting here is not necessarily not the truth, because I guess it's not like they're intentionally lying, but you'd be trained to understand what's coming out of the mouth of babes as an innocent comment and words learned versus what's actually the underlying scenario.
Yeah, and I'm always thrilled to hear when children say they really dislike when they get in trouble and mum or dad or both send them to their room. And I'm like, okay, good. We've got good parenting boundaries. We've got appropriate behavior management strategies. So likewise with that, boring is one of the most common words that we hear. And so then the next question might be something like, well, tell me your favourite thing about mum. Oh, she always takes me to the park and we went, so that it mostly all comes out in the wash anyway. 5-year-olds are notorious for, they yell at me and they tell me what to do and I'll be like, if I was there, what would I hear? What would I see? And they'll be like, Tom, that is not okay. Go to your room. And you think, yep, okay, good, excellent. Really happy to hear that level of parenting. So you're right. And there are those developmental ages 4, 5, 6, 7 where the truth is a bit loose. That's developmentally expected. We know that. So then we ask more questions and find that out where, we get creative in trying to ascertain. And you've already got the parents' narrative as well. And quite often the parents aren't particularly disputing the quality of the children's relationships. They're disputing different aspects of that. So you already know that there is, a playing field to some degree as well. So, the proportion of weight that goes on a child's views and wishes is part of our assessment. And so part of our role is to let the parents know or the judicial officer know, does this child present with the cognitive maturity, developmental capacity, cognition overall, that we are really going to place considerable weight on their views and wishes. So.
And Leisa, you used to be a children's lawyer, so you're probably quite used to understanding children, but also understanding parents and how their reactions and feedback and responses can be.
Yes, and they can be very different. But that's all about, as Laura was intimating before, it's about controlling how to release the information to the parent. I mean, there are my interpretation of a family report may not be my client's interpretation, where from a legal point of view, I might look at a report and go, that's not too bad, that's okay. Whereas a parent might read it and go, oh my God, I don't know who she thought she was interviewing, but it wasn't me, So it's all about having to deal with that perception that parents have about what the information that they're reading, what it really means to them in a legal perspective.
What tips would you have for parents who may not even not be going through a divorce or separation, but how do we stop this cycle of toxicity in our relationships that are damaging our children? Let's be honest, it's affecting future generations. How do we stop it?
I think, we go back to the conversation we had earlier that I think, society owes a lot to help us as humans to learn these skills, to be able to understand self-responsibility, to be able to understand that the way we communicate with people regardless of our intention, we actually also need to consider the way that lands on somebody else, and then being able to take responsibility for, even though that might not have been how you intended that or the delivery of that, this is how that's been experienced or interpreted by somebody else.
Yeah, in my view, people lack a lot of insight about their own conduct. I don't know what you do about that. I think that comes from people going into therapy and going to some sort of form of counselling to, as you say, hold that mirror up. The question you have asked is the fundamental reason why people like Laura and I exist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that critical friend is a really important element of, who should be part of my team when I'm going through a separation. It needs to be ideally a professional who's got experience in working with separated families, because it is a very specialised area, because they need to be able to have that those lateral thinking skills, that critical thinking to say, well, okay, so I'm hearing your experience of that. I wonder how you would think about that if I was to deliver that in this way. So you need somebody who's being able to help you to
break it down,
be reflective, to break it down, and to take some of that emotion out.
But I also, when I'm explaining parenting or family reports to my clients, I have to keep reminding them that the report is about their children and what's in the best interest of their children, because they are so focused on those 3 or 4 pages that deal with them, and they're not looking at, a couple of pages in that talks about their children and what the recommendations are.
Laura, what advice would you give to parents who might be going through the process of having a report done?
Yeah, I think it is about thinking about before you come in, how can I engage in this process in the way that allows the person that I've engaged or my lawyer's engaged to do this work to hear and understand what my genuine position and worries are. Yeah, it is about filtering through to think about, how do I get across, because people come with genuine grievances about the other parent, and whilst they might not to everybody else seem like they're a big deal, in that polarized world, when you're not your best self, they are big. So it's about coming in and really being as honest and almost as vulnerable as you can allow yourself to be in that process, so that we get a really good understanding around why is this particular issue or this particular topic, which in the grand scheme of things, when you're living your best life, you probably wouldn't see as a big deal either. Why is it really bothering you? So that we can actually really get to the bottom of what are those principles or what are those values that are really being a barrier at this point in time for us to understand what it is about your children or the life you want them to live that you're concerned won't happen if proposal A or B occurs.
I'm glad you said that, because that's actually how I explain it to my clients, because there's a lot of preconception about, well, what do I do? Do I take a whole bundle of information? I'm going to take my photo album in, I'm going to show Laura all these amazing things we do with our children, etc. And that's really how I explain it, that you've just got to go in there, be raw. And just tell it how it is.
Yeah, because our job is to understand their experience, and to help their family heal through this process, with their children being absolutely championed in this process.
You're not the enemy.
Yeah, this is what your children need of you right now. Here are the supports or options you can take within community to get that scaffolding if you don't have that right now. It's okay that you're not okay. But here is the path to be okay, because your children need you to get on board.
Can I ask you a question? I'm seeing more and more children being diagnosed, ADHD, attention deficit disorder. It seems to be, this is really quite indicative in our society now. How do you, when you're putting a report together with respect to those elements regarding children, do you take that on board when you are assessing the children and then putting that back in, and that formulates what to do in relation to the outcomes?
You have no idea how thrilled I am that you've raised that. And my anecdotal experience, particularly over the last probably 3 or 4 years, is that, children, this rise of neurodiversity diagnosis is becoming more and more prevalent. I think that we could agree, without some research behind us, I'm sure there is plenty, that, parenting a child with a disability or a conduct disorder or anything like that then adds more pressure to the task of, insanely parenting already. So more commonly we will see a high proportion of those families because, those families unfortunately fall apart with all that additional stress. I think there is just so much opportunity that I see for us to move forward in terms of helping parents to get a good shared understanding of each other, and healing is for us to have more knowledge around, the statistics in terms of diagnoses for autistic children or ADHD children, and a parent also having a diagnosis who's often undiagnosed sits around that 80-something%. And particularly I have a special interest area in working with autistic children and families, and quite often the profile I will see of a parent or both parents, which can sometimes be framed as a parent coming in to say, oh, he's really narcissistic, or there's all these family violence behaviours. When I undertake that assessment and learn about the family, whilst I'm not, it's not my role or my qualification to certainly diagnose any of those things, you're actually working with a family where there's neurodiversity in the parents, and that personality structure is coming out as very rigid, very tunnel-minded. It actually mirrors the profile of the child. And so helping parents to be able to say, oh, well, maybe we need to consider that the ways of communicating in this family need some additional support altogether, because we are seeing this big rise of diagnoses, which is a great outcome for children to grow up having a good sense of the way their brain operates, the way they exist in the world, their sensory needs. And then the more we know about those individual needs of the children, the better able we are to make recommendations that are going to fit with that profile. For children who genuinely struggle with transitions, highly anxious children with neurodiversity, to ask them to then do 3 or 4 transitions in a week is absolutely putting them into a place of, stimulation distress and emotional distress. So we have to know these things, whether diagnosed or not.
As you said, we're seeing a rise in neurodivergent children, parents not diagnosed. The family landscape is very different to what it was 50 years ago. Has the family court system kept up with that, or do things need to change?
There is a lot of education around this in the family court, and a lot of education in relation to family law practitioners in general, because we're all very aware this is so prevalent. I think that it's a work in progress. I think I need to put it as high as that. Laura?
It's a great question. I think that we are making some good progress. I think the Lighthouse Project, which is also getting international recognition at the moment, is really starting to help move the system forward to say the centre of this system needs to be children, because the paramount consideration for the parenting orders we're making are the best interests of the children. And what we then need to do is to continue to review and look at to say, how do we enable and facilitate the system to allow each of the professionals in that system to meet that that paramount consideration. Why are we asking legally trained practitioners to sometimes make decisions about a child's developmental overnight time? Why are we sometimes asking single expert witnesses to make decisions about things that are evidence factored? You know, we need to be able to support the roles in a better way. I don't think we have the answer to that yet. I think the two pathways in terms of the legal field, the social science field, are probably working the best that they have been in terms of helping to champion each other's role and really learn and understand from each other. Can we do more to centre children in that process? Absolutely. And where that path takes us, I'm not sure, but I think we're on the right track, and I'm really excited to see where that goes.
So I've always been a very big advocate about having social scientists like yourself be way more involved in high-level litigation involving children in the family court. I don't think there's enough money provided for that to occur. I think if we had way more intervention by people like Laura at the base level when these sorts of issues arise with families as they initiate their application, and we get the social scientists in very early, then I think there's there are better prospects of resolving the matter than having the matter go in 2 years' time to a 5-day trial. I feel that there could be better money spent in social scientists being allocated to a family in the family court, and that they keep in check with that family as it goes through the process. I think if there's some management around it, my personal view, I think that there might be a reflection at the other end of reducing these trial times, my view.
Which is an interesting part. My personal view, Leisa, is where this can sometimes seem, I guess, upside down on its head for me is I wonder if we flip that timeline to say, let's get the evidence and the facts out of the way at the beginning. Did the family violence occur? Let's run that trial, and then we can assess, well, what now is the level of risk? If it was found, I think where it gets tricky is that earlier and earlier on in the piece, we're being engaged, which is terrific from that relational point of view and weeding out what are the key issues.
But you can't draw a conclusion because they'll hold on to the allegation and say, yes, but you don't understand.
Yeah.
There was domestic violence in the relationship, and then you can't bring a conclusion to that because that's got to be tested.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we're being asked to then, a lot of our assessments are saying if the court finds the family violence did occur, this, and this. Actually, in my experience, and this is just anecdotal from my 20 years in family risk assessment, if the court were enabled to make those decisions early, that's their expertise. It's not my job to look at the evidence. If they can then inform us rather than us informing them in a more, I guess, hypothetical way, if the court informed us early to say, the facts are family violence happens, this is the outcome, drugs and alcohol have occurred, here's the evidence, then we can write a really solid risk assessment and framework and pathway for this family. At the moment, in my experience, it feels a little bit like the system protracts itself because our report is saying, well, we need to find out these things. We need a psych assessment. We need some CDT testing. We need drug and alcohol testing. And then we're waiting for the court to determine did or did not this happen? Is there family violence? And then we're asking the judge, because often that's then occurring at the point of final trial, we're then asking that judge to come down to the nitty-gritties of what time and what structure of that arrangement should be made. And we're asking an incredibly experienced and legally trained professional to then jump over into this developmental social science lens at that point to be making final orders, which I could only imagine is very stressful for them, because how do they actually know, apart from their acquired knowledge from reading lots of family reports, what is a good developmental time for a 6-month-old baby? You know, now that they've found those facts, it then doesn't get to come back to our side of the fence to say, thank you for finding all of this evidence, which is totally outside of our field. We can now tell you what is a really good developmental and child-centred parenting plan to go from here.
And to give you time to think about it, because how often have you been in a trial where a judge has turned to you and said, well, Ms. Dodds, if I make a finding that this violence occurred, what would you recommend? I mean, you've then got to flip again, haven't you, and try and work out, well, okay, if there was this finding, then this is where I'm going to lead into, because that's the snapshot, isn't it? You only get that hour or that 30 minutes to formulate an answer that everyone's been waiting 2 years for.
And if we can be even more frank than that, Leisa, we only get the opportunity to provide that knowledge around our expertise if we're asked. So in that trial, the questions that we're asked are being driven and developed typically by counsel. Now, counsel are trained, again, in that legal discourse. Yeah, they're highly experienced legal people. They're not necessarily asking me the best questions for the judge to know what is in that child's best interest. They're running their legal case because that's what they're paid to do. And I always get alarmed about that, and I find the final trial incredibly frustrating that I'm genuinely silenced most of the time in being able to share information with the judge that is likely to assist them in their decision because the questions weren't asked, and sometimes that might be a very good legal strategy in their role, which is great. That's doing their role. But I can't help but question, actually, they're just only able to ask the questions they know to ask. They're not social science trained. They haven't, in their undergraduate studies of law, been given training around child development. They don't know how to do a risk assessment in terms of children's needs and developmental needs, and why should they? Likewise, I have had no training in evidence or legal aspects. And so I think some of those fundamental flaws in terms of, are we genuinely meeting, these human rights aspects for our kids, their best interest principles, with the system operating the way it does?
So that you've just hit the nail on the head, because you are coming from a complete social scientist point of view. As a lawyer, when we are advocating for our client, we never want to ask the question that we know the answer to, which might be adverse to our client's interests.
100%.
And that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
That's the problem for the child, which, in my opinion, is the problem about the system, because the legislation is very clear. And in my personal opinion, the system as it stands, where it's adversarial, judicial-led system, is fundamentally undermining the legislation that we're being asked to do. And that's not the people in the system. They're doing an incredible job at what role they're playing. But the system is setting us all up to fail these kids. Slowly we're making good progress, like Lighthouse and things like that. But do we need a massive stop, retake to say, why are we trying to make decisions about children's biopsychosocial needs in a legally led space? Needs to be reviewed. Yeah, we need the legal space to do everything it's doing, but we need to re-engage the process to work differently.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting take on it. Yeah.
That's just my 2 cents.
Well, I think it's powerful.
It's nearly like if there's children involved, it needs to be handled with the silos removed and it be a really holistic, collaborative space. But if there aren't children involved, and it's handled more as a legal financial black and white kind of scenario. This is yours, this is theirs, go away.
Yeah.
You never
Let
have
the
to speak
legal
again.
issues be dealt with by the
Separate.
legal, like family violence. There's absolutely legal issues there to be evidence, did it happen? Great. After that, let it go back to the family violence experts. Let it then go back to the child experts to say, okay, we know the lay of the land now. It feels quite topsy-turvy at the moment because the system was developed so long ago.
But it also helps you, doesn't it? Because then you don't have the parents saying, oh no, that never happened.
Yeah.
Because once you've got that finding, you can say, well, actually, no, I've got a finding and I can base my report on that now.
Yeah.
So, Laura, how important are people like Leisa, those legal professionals and solicitors, in the process of getting the best outcome for the child?
Absolutely integral. But the power sits in people like Leisa, who come with those values and that overarching, focus on what is the legislation and what is my scope. It is about helping parents to filter through in layman's terms, exactly as you've said before, okay, this is actually in our legal context what the information is that we need to be foregrounding, prioritising. This is what's been said about your child, rather than getting caught up in, oh, he told her that never happened, It's an incredibly important part. It's incredibly important for children that their parents know what their rights are and understand, those legal parameters of what they can and can't ask for. That's how we avoid people becoming victims or abused, because they do know their power and their role. And also they have earned and hold a very entrusted role for those parents in the most vulnerable time in their life. And they can become and should become an incredible ally through that process around helping them to stay really focused and keeping somewhat grounded despite all of the chaos going on around them. Yeah.
And Leisa, what would your final advice be for parents who might be in this high conflict, highly combative scenario where there are children involved?
Step back, and it's not all about you, and it's not all about what outcome you want. You've got to understand the fundamental principle of the Family Law Act is what's in the best interest of the children. So what is in the best interest of your children, regardless of the fact that you don't really want that to be an outcome. That's really what it is. People out there are wasting a lot of money arguing over their children when their fundamental premise is it's what I want. And that's, to me, that's very, it's disheartening.
Yeah, it's scary. Laura, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think entirely of the same path on that. Take a moment to breathe, take a moment to put yourself behind the eyes of your child in 5, 10, 20 years' time, and think about what you would want your parent to be doing in this situation. What experience, what childhood are you wanting your child to have, and then create that.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, Leisa and Laura, it's been an incredibly intense conversation, but an incredibly important topic, which I know we could probably sit here for another couple of hours and keep talking and solving all of the issues. But I just wanted to thank both of you for your expertise and your passion and your care for what you bring to this issue of family law. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Laticia. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Follow Toomey Family Law on LinkedIn, Facebook and YouTube for more practical family law support.